Hi, I'm Amanda. In this short film, I'll be telling the story of migration to South Australia, from the colony's beginnings to the present day. Aboriginal people have occupied this continent for millennia. Visitors from other lands began arriving hundreds of years ago, but it was not until the British established the colony of New South Wales in 1788 that migration to Australia was officially recorded. We'll be charting the changing composition of the migrant population through time, using dots to represent the regions people came from: Britain and Ireland, Europe, Asia, Africa and the Middle East, and the Americas. The size of the dot indicates the size of the migrant population. In its early years, the colony of South Australia is mostly composed of people from Britain, with rapidly growing numbers from Ireland. It also becomes home to our first refugees, German Lutherans fleeing religious persecution. What's the story with Irish migration? I am so glad you asked me. Irish migration to South Australia increases in response to the devastating potato famines in the 1840s and is aided by assisted passages. By 1855, more than 4,000 young women have arrived to work as domestic servants. Irish migration peaks in 1881, with the Irish-born forming 10% of the population. The discovery of gold in Victoria in the 1850s draws many South Australians east, as well as bringing large numbers of fortune seekers from China and elsewhere through the colony. A new gold rush in the 1870s near Darwin in South Australia's Northern Territory again brings miners from China, and the colony's Chinese-born population peaks in the 1880s. The passage of the colony's Chinese Restriction Act in 1881 is one response and leads to a rapid decline in numbers. In 1901, the newly established federal government passes the Commonwealth Immigration Restriction Act, known as the White Australia Policy, which effectively excludes non-white migrants for the next half a century. In the early 20th century, the pace of migration slows and the Australian-born population begins to far outnumber those born overseas. In the aftermath of the Second World War, migration to Australia changes significantly. Concerns about post-war labour shortages, population size and the ability of Australia to defend itself leads the federal government to introduce generous assisted passage schemes to encourage more British migration. At the same time, tens of thousands of displaced persons from camps across Europe arrive in Australia under an agreement with the International Refugee Organisation. So how does this affect South Australia? The 1954 South Australian census lists significant numbers of overseas-born residents from previously unrepresented countries, including Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, the Netherlands, Poland, Ukraine and Austria. The assisted passage schemes continue until the 1970s and dramatically increase the number of European-born South Australians, in particular Greeks and Italians. This period also shows the last British spike. Why? Well, it's because it's time for change. The post-Second World War mass migration schemes from Europe end, and Australia thankfully abolishes the discriminatory White Australia policy. These changes reverberate through the last decade of the 20th century. From the 1970s onwards, Australia begins to accept migrants and refugees from non-European countries, including Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia and Korea. We see significant growth in Asian-born populations in South Australia, while at the same time the proportion of migrants from the UK and Ireland declines. In the same period, refugees from South America arrive in increasing numbers, as do those from the Middle East. Migration from the former USSR and Baltic states increases after the collapse of communism in 1989. So what about the new millennium? 21st century migration to Australia is characterised by a growing emphasis on skilled migration and by a shift from centrally planned permanent migration to a temporary migration regime that is flexible and responsive to regional and industry needs. Between 2006 and 2015, the number of temporary visa holders present in Australia rises from about 380,000 to over 800,000. China and India become the top 2 countries from which temporary skilled migrants to South Australia come. In 2016, the 5 biggest sources of international students to South Australia are China, India, Hong Kong, Malaysia and Vietnam. Australia's humanitarian program continues, and this further diversifies South Australia's population with the arrival of significant numbers of settlers from Afghanistan, Iraq and African countries, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Burundi, Mauritius, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda and Zambia. So in conclusion, we can see that patterns of migration to South Australia have changed significantly from the early days of the colony to the present. In the 21st century, temporary migration has overtaken permanent migration, and South Australia now draws migrants from a far wider range of countries than ever before. In 2011, almost half of South Australians were born overseas or had at least one parent that was. We come from almost 180 different countries, speak over 160 languages and contribute to a vibrant culture that values diversity and recognises the importance of migration to social and economic development. And that's what makes South Australia great.